Welcome to another deep dive, this time into a pretty captivating maritime disaster, the sinking of the steamship Arctic in 1854. You've provided a fascinating New York Times article from that year with two firsthand accounts. And it's one thing to read the basic facts, but these personal stories, wow, they really bring it to life and offer a glimpse into human behavior when facing a disaster.
Yeah, it's amazing how those accounts can really transport you back in time.
Mhm.
You're not just reading about history, you're experiencing it through the eyes of those who actually lived through it.
Exactly. So let's set the scene. The Arctic was top of the line back in 1854. This wasn't just a ship. This was a luxurious technological marvel. People were excited to be sailing on it. From Liverpool to New York, can you imagine that sense of adventure and optimism they must have felt?
Absolutely. The Arctic was a point of national pride for America. It was owned by the Collins Line, an American company that was trying to compete with the dominant British shipping lines at the time. The Arctic was their flagship, symbolizing American ambition and innovation in the maritime world.
It's almost like the Titanic in a way, this idea of an unsinkable ship. But then, just off the coast of Newfoundland, disaster struck. The Arctic collided with a much smaller vessel called the Vesta.
And here's where things get interesting. The Vesta had an iron prow, which pierced the Arctic's wooden hull. It created a breach that was much harder to contain than anyone realized. Even though the Arctic seemed fine at first, it was taking on water rapidly.
So this wasn't just a little bump.
No, not at all. And this is where human judgment comes into play. The Arctic's crew, confident in their ship's technology and perhaps a bit too proud, decided to press on towards land. Instead of stopping to assess the damage, they thought they could make it.
That is a decision that has probably haunted them ever since.
It certainly had tragic consequences. And it's a pattern we see in other maritime disasters.
Okay.
Think of the Titanic. There's often this initial disbelief, a reluctance to accept how serious the situation is, especially when you're dealing with a ship that's supposed to be the best in safety and engineering.
It's like the technology itself creates a false sense of security.
Exactly. We see this even today with things like airplane crashes or even large-scale industrial accidents. There's often a delayed response, a failure to grasp how big the problem is, because we have so much faith in our systems and our ability to control them.
Okay, so the Arctic is taking on water, and the crew has made this critical error in judgment. What happens next?
Well, that's when the situation starts to unravel. One of the first-hand accounts we have is from a survivor named George H. Burns. He was a second-class passenger, and his story is absolutely riveting. He describes the growing chaos on board as things get worse and worse.
Okay, let's hear from Mr. Burns.
He talks about passengers firing signal guns, trying desperately to attract attention. Others are launching lifeboats, but it quickly becomes clear that there aren't enough for everyone.
Oh no. This is where the panic must have set in.
Absolutely. And amidst this escalating fear, the rigid social hierarchy of the Victorian era becomes glaringly apparent.
You mean like women and children first?
Yes, but it goes deeper than that. Burns mentions helping to build a raft. But he makes it clear this wasn't for everyone. It was primarily for the crew and lower-class passengers like himself. The lifeboats, on the other hand, were reserved for women, children, and first-class passengers.
So even in a life or death situation, social class was still a major factor.
It's a stark reminder of the inequalities back then. And it raises a question that's still relevant today. Would those same social dynamics play out in a similar disaster today? It's something to think about.
Definitely. So we have this chaotic scene unfolding, people scrambling for lifeboats, this makeshift raft being built, and all the while the Arctic is sinking.
Right. And Burns doesn't shy away from describing the terror on board. He mentions seeing the captain trying to maintain order. But you can sense that things are slipping out of control.
It's hard to even imagine what was going through people's minds at that point.
It must have been absolutely terrifying. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into those final harrowing moments as the Arctic succumbs to the sea.
So the Arctic is going down. And as you mentioned, the social order is breaking down too. It must have been absolute chaos.
Burns describes it as a scene of terror and confusion beyond description. People making desperate choices, driven by that primal instinct to survive.
And you said the raft, the one for the lower class passengers and crew, was quickly overwhelmed. What happened there?
Burns says, a rush was made passengers and firemen precipitated themselves headlong over the bulwarks onto the raft. He paints this picture of people just throwing themselves onto this flimsy raft,
Yeah.
desperate for any chance of survival.
It's heartbreaking knowing that not everyone could fit.
And this is where we see that dark side of human nature in survival situations. Burns recounts someone shouting, "Every man for himself." It shows how in these moments of extreme stress, social norms and morals can be completely abandoned.
That's chilling. Did he say what happened on the raft? I can only imagine it was a fight for space and resources.
He does mention that it was dangerously overloaded. He says, "Our little ark was full and in imminent danger of being swamped and sunk. They were literally clinging to a piece of wood, barely staying afloat."
It's hard to fathom that level of fear and desperation.
Absolutely. But amidst all this chaos, Burns also describes acts of incredible courage. He talks about the third mate, Dorian, who refused to abandon ship, even when it was clear the Arctic was going down.
Yeah, you mentioned this before. It's remarkable. What did Dorian do?
Burns quotes Dorian urging the captain to clear the raft so they could work to save as many people as possible. He said, "For God's sake, Captain, clear the raft so that we can work. I won't desert the ship while there's timber above water." He stayed on board until the very end, trying to help others.
Wow, that's true selflessness. Knowing he was going to die, but still putting others first.
It really makes you think about what motivates people to act so heroically in these situations.
What do you think was going through his mind? Was it pure duty, a sense of responsibility, or something else?
That's a question psychologists and philosophers have pondered for centuries. What drives someone to risk their own life for others? Especially when there's no expectation of reward or recognition. Some theories point to empathy and compassion. Others suggest it's about adhering to a strong moral code, or a sense of duty that goes beyond personal survival.
It's such a powerful example of the human capacity for both good and evil. On the one hand, you have people fighting for their own survival. And on the other, you have someone like Dorian willingly sacrificing himself for others.
Exactly. And Burns captures both sides of this human spectrum in his account.
So Dorian stays on board, the raft is overloaded, and the Arctic is sinking fast. What happens in those final moments?
Burns doesn't hold back on the details. He talks about the stern of the ship disappearing beneath the waves, the sounds of people screaming, and then this eerie silence that fell over the water.
It must have been a scene of utter devastation.
It was Burns describes one wild yell that he still remembers, the sound of hundreds of people realizing their fate. He talks about seeing bodies floating in the water, men, women, and children.
Were there any women on the raft?
He doesn't mention any specifically, but he does say that many women were lost in the sinking. This goes back to what we were discussing earlier about the social hierarchy. Women and children were supposed to be given priority on the lifeboats, but in the chaos, it seems, many were left behind.
That's just tragic. So what about Burns? How did he survive?
He was incredibly lucky. He managed to get into one of the remaining lifeboats, and after a harrowing night at sea, he was rescued by a passing ship called the Huron. It was a bark, which is a type of sailing vessel with 3 or more masts.
A bark. I'm not familiar with that term.
They were quite common in those days. Think of a classic pirate ship with multiple sails. That's essentially what a bark was.
Okay, I can picture it now. So Burns is rescued by this bark. What about the other survivors?
The Huron picked up several other lifeboats, and Burns spent that night huddled with other survivors listening to their stories. He describes the relief, the exhaustion, and the profound sense of loss that permeated the group.
It's hard to imagine the trauma they all endured.
Absolutely. And their ordeal wasn't over. We actually have another first-hand account from a different passenger who was also rescued by the Huron. This account sheds light on what happened to those who were left clinging to the raft.
What happened on that raft? I have a bad feeling about this.
You're right to be worried. The rescued passenger stated that 72 men were alive on the raft after the Arctic sank. But by the next morning, only 3 remained.
Oh my God, only 3 out of 72.
It's a chilling testament to the brutal reality of survival at sea, exposed to the elements with no food or water, and the raft likely in constant danger of capsizing. Those men faced an almost impossible fight.
You mentioned earlier that some people believe there are recurring patterns in human behavior during disasters. Do we see any of those patterns play out in this account from the raft?
We do. This account, although brief, suggests that the men on the raft likely experienced a breakdown of social order. Imagine being crammed onto a tiny, unstable platform with limited resources and the vast ocean all around you. In such a situation, desperation and self-preservation can quickly take over.
So likely there were struggles for space, maybe even fights over what little food and water they had.
That's unfortunately very possible. And while we don't have specific details, it's a scenario that has played out in other survival situations. When people are pushed to their limits, the veneer of civilization can be very thin.
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
And it makes the tragedy of the Arctic even more profound.
It does. And it reminds us that even in the face of technological advancements, we're still vulnerable to the forces of nature, and perhaps even more so to the complexities of human behavior.
Wow, it's hard to grasp the scale of this tragedy. So many lives lost. And in such horrific circumstances, it really makes you think.
It does. The Arctic disaster wasn't just a tragedy for those involved. It had a huge impact on American society.
Yeah.
Remember, this was when transatlantic travel was still new, and steamships were seen as these symbols of progress and pride.
So the sinking of the Arctic was like a blow to that pride.
Absolutely. It challenged this idea that technology could just conquer nature and guarantee safety at sea. Newspapers were filled with accounts of the sinking, and the public was horrified and captivated by the story.
It's interesting how a disaster like this can really capture the public imagination. Why do you think people were so drawn to it?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. First, the human element. Stories of survival, loss, and heroism always resonate. The Arctic sinking had all of that, and more. Ordinary people facing unimaginable terror. Acts of incredible courage, like Third Mate Dorian. And the heartbreaking reality of those who didn't make it.
Those are the details that stay with you, the human stories behind the statistics.
Exactly. But I think there was also a deeper societal impact. The Arctic was a symbol of American ingenuity and technological advancement. Its sinking shattered this illusion of invincibility. It forced people to confront the inherent risks of ocean travel.
It must have been a wake-up call.
It was. And it wasn't just about the fear of travel. The sinking of the Arctic also sparked a lot of debate and soul-searching within American society. People began to question the safety regulations, the responsibility of shipping lines, and even the social inequalities that were exposed during the evacuation.
So this tragedy kind of forced people to look inward and examine their own values and beliefs.
Exactly. And it led to some important changes. For example, after the Arctic disaster, there were calls for stricter lifeboat regulations and better safety protocols on passenger ships. There was also more scrutiny on the training and qualifications of ship crews.
It's like they say every cloud has a silver lining, a terrible tragedy, but it spurred some positive changes that may have prevented other disasters.
That's a good way to put it. The legacy of the Arctic is both tragic and transformative. It's a reminder of the fragility of human life, even with technological progress. But it also highlights our capacity for learning adaptation and creating a safer world.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. I feel like I've not only learned about a historical event, but also gained some insights into human nature and how we respond to crises.
That's the power of history. It lets us connect with the past, learn from the mistakes and triumphs of those who came before us, and hopefully apply those lessons to our own lives.
And the first-hand accounts, like the one from George H. Burns, really bring it all to life.
Those accounts are invaluable. They give us a glimpse into the thoughts, feelings, and actions of real people in really extraordinary circumstances. They remind us that history isn't just facts and dates. It's a story of human experience with all its complexities and contradictions.
So what do you think is the most important takeaway from the Arctic disaster? What should we as listeners carry with us from this story?
I think the most important takeaway is that despite all our technological advancements, we are still vulnerable to the unpredictable nature of the world. Disasters can happen, and when they do, it's our values, our choices, and our actions that truly define us.
That's a powerful thought. It's not just about surviving the disaster, but about how we conduct ourselves when facing it.
Exactly. The Arctic story challenges us to consider, what would we do in a similar situation? How would we prioritize human life, fairness, and compassion? These are questions we should all be asking, not just in the context of disaster preparedness, but in our everyday lives.
It's about building a society where those values are at the forefront, even when times get tough.
Absolutely. And while the Arctic disaster is a stark reminder of the potential for tragedy and loss, it also highlights that enduring power of the human spirit, the resilience, courage, and compassion that can emerge even in the darkest of times.
I think that's a great note to end on, a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, there's always hope.
Thank you for taking us on this deep dive. It's been truly insightful.
It's been my pleasure. And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. We hope you found it as thought-provoking and engaging as